So at this point, we have everything we need to create the configuration file. We have an implementation of the user detail service. We have the authorization filter, the access deny handler, the entry point. So we're ready to use those in our configuration file. So let's go over to the main package and then create a new package. I'm just going to call it configuration. And then in that configuration package, I'm going to create a new class. I'm just going to call it security configuration. And in this class, the first thing I need to do is I need to extend another class called web security configure adapter. And this class has two methods that we need to override to create our security configuration in the application. So let's do extend, and that's going to be web security configure adapter, and it's this one right here. And then at this point, we have to override those two methods. So let's do that. So we're going to override one method called configure, and that takes the authentication manager builder. So as you can see, here it is. It takes the authentication manager builder, and we also have to override another one, and that's going to be the same method because they're doing method overloading in this class, but that takes the HTTP security. So that would be this one right here. It's going to be pretty simple. So in the authentication manager builder, we just have to tell it which user detail service that we're using. And also, we have to also pass in a bcrypt encoder because, Spring Security is not going to try to save users and a password in plain text. It needs to have an encoder so that you can hash passwords and then save those hash passwords in the database. So before I continue, let me bring in everything that we created so far. So that's going to be private, that's going to be the JWT authorization. So I went ahead and then bring in the authorization filter, the access deny handler, the authentication entry point, and the user detail service that we just implemented. And there's one more thing I need to bring in, which I just mentioned, and that's going to be the bcrypt encoder. So let's do bcrypt encoder, and we're just going to call it bcrypt encoder. So now we have to create a constructor for this class so that we can wire in all of those beans. So let's go ahead and do that. So I created this constructor right here. I didn't want to just sit down and type all of this out because, it's a simple constructor. You already know how that works. And I just pass in everything that we need to wire in the constructor. So now I just have to add the annotation add auto wire. So add auto wire. Okay, so now everything that we've built so far, which is all of those three, including the encoder that we will need, we auto wiring in the configuration file right here. Okay, so now that we have all of those in, we can then pass them into those methods so that we can tell the configuration what to use for what. So here we have to pass in the user detail service, and that's just going to be the user detail service that we implemented. So we're just telling Spring use our user detail service. So if, for instance, you go into this class, right? So if we go into this class, the user detail service, you'll see that it's not ours, it's coming from Spring. But we do have a class. Let's go back to the implementation. You can see that we're implementing this class, right? So we have to tell Spring Security to use our implementation for this user detail service, and that's what we're doing here. We're just telling it, hey, use this user detail service from our class, from our application, which is why we're using the same qualifier that we use in the user detail service implementation right here. Okay, so we're just telling it to use our user detail service, and that's what we're doing here for the authentication manager builder. And then we also have to pass the password encoder. So we're going to do password encoder, and then we pass in the encoder that we're creating right here. And that should be all we need to do for the configure. That takes the authentication manager. And now let's move on to the next one. Now the next one is going to be a little bit longer. So what we have to do here, we have to pass in everything that we want Spring Security to manage in terms of endpoint or URL. So we're going to tell it which URL to secure, which ones to leave open to the world, and we have to also tell it our session management, and we have to pass in all of the the filters and handlers that we just created here. So the first thing we have to do, we have to tell it to not use cross-site with cross-forgery. So we're going to do CSRF, which stands for cross-site with cross-forgery. We need to disable that because we're not using it. And then we have to add cross-origin resource sharing, because we don't want anyone from any URL to be able to connect to our API. We want a specific list or a specific URL or a specific domain to access our API. So that's why we have to add CORS into this. So we just have to do that, CORS. We can also disable it like this, but I wouldn't recommend that, because that means that anyone from any domain can send a request to your application, and the application will not reject it. It will try to process it, and we don't want that to happen. So we're just gonna add it but not disable it. And then what we need to do, we need to tell Spring Security about our session. So we have to do session management, and then we have to tell it that our session creation policy is going to be stateless. So session creation policy, and then here we're gonna pass stateless. Okay. So what that means is that how like traditionally when a user logs in, they would have like a session, and then the server would keep track of who is logged in, and whenever they try to access the application would reach out to another server and see if they can find like a valid session for that user and all that stuff. Then that's stateful, because we're constantly keeping track of who is logged into the application. But with JSON Web Token, we don't need to keep track of who is logged in. Once someone logs in successfully once, we're gonna give them a token that's gonna expire after a certain number of days, and then we just ask them for that token every time they come into the application to do anything. So that's why here we're specifying that our session management is going to be stateless, because we're not gonna be tracking anyone who logs into the application like that. So after that, we have to specify the public URLs that we want Spring Security to allow. So we have to do authorize request, and then we have to pass in the int matchers here. So the int matchers, if you remember, they're coming from our security constant, and that would be the public URL. So that's going to be public URLs. So we're telling it, hey, all of those URLs, if you remember, let's go back in there just for a refresher. So you can see we have a list or an array of URL here that we're allowing user to be able to access without being authenticated. So that's what we're doing. We're telling it, hey, for those URLs, you don't need to authenticate. And then after that, so we have to say permit all on those URL. Okay, so we're permitting everyone on those URL. We could specify who can access those open URLs as well. We could specify a specific domain or whatever, but we're not doing that here. We're just saying, hey, for those URL, just leave them open to everyone. And then after that, we have to say anything else. So any requests we want to authenticate. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So we're saying if it's one of those URL, we're gonna permit everyone to access them. Otherwise, anything else we want to authenticate. So that's what we're doing here. And then at this point, we can pass in our exception handling and authentication entry point and a filter. So those are the last three we have to add. So we can do end, and then let's add in the exception handling. So we're gonna call the exception handling that, oops. And now we have to say for what we want to handle this exception for. So here we're gonna say access deny handler, and then of course we're gonna pass in our access deny handler, which is this one. And we pass it in here. So if you remember, the access deny handler is just gonna return the unauthorized for a 401 to the user, because they're not allowed to access the application. So whenever they get an access denied, they will be presented with this access deny handler that we created. And then after that, we can pass in the authentication entry point. So we're gonna do that authentication entry point, and of course we pass in ours. And lastly, we just have to pass in our filter. So we're gonna do add filter before, because it's gonna happen before all the other filters. And then we're gonna say this is gonna be for the GWT authorization filter here. And then we're just gonna tell it what class it's for. So that's gonna be username, password, authentication filter, that class. So believe it or not, at this point, our configuration is done for the security. There's a lot more that you can add to this configuration, but this should be like enough for us to work with the security here. So again, just to recap, we're telling it we're not going to be using cross-site request forgery, so we're disabling that, and then we are adding course, which means if someone was not specified as a domain that can access this application, they will be rejected. And then we're specifying our session management, which is going to be stateless, because we're not using anything like session or anything like that. So we're not going to like constantly keeping track of the users that are logging in, because they're going to come in and log in. We're going to give them a token, and every time after that they access the application, they need to give us that token so we can verify it. So that's really stateless. We don't care about them at all unless they come into the application and make a request. So that's what this is doing. And then after that, we specify all of the URLs that are public. So we're going to say permit all on all the public URLs that we defined earlier. And then after that, we say, hey, anything else that is not part of this URL, just authenticate. And then after that, we just pass in the access deny handler, the authentication entry point, and our authorization filter. So that's what we're doing here. Now, we also have to bring in a bean of the authentication manager. So let's do that. So we're going to do bean, and that's going to be overriding a method from the super class. So we're going to do override, and that's going to return, let's do public. It's going to return an authentication manager. So let's do authentication manager. And let's just call it authentication manager. It's not going to take anything because it's just returning a bean. And then here, all we have to do is just return the bean from the super class. So we're going to do return, and we're going to call the super class or the parent class. And then we're going to do authentication manager bean here. Okay. So now that we have this bean, we should be good to go. And I think this method throws an exception, which is why it's giving us this error. So let's do throw exception, and that should go away. So as you can see, this is a very simple configuration, but it's very, very powerful, and it's going to do all the tricks that we needed to do in terms of security. So let's add the annotation that we need to add on this class. So the first one is going to be configuration, because this is a configuration file. So we're going to do configuration. The second one is going to be the enable web security, because we have to enable web security. So let's do add and enable web security. And then the last one that I want to put in is enable global method security. And this is going to allow us to have security at a method level. And we have one property we have to specify here, because by default it's false, and that's the pre-post enabled. And all this is going to do is just to allow us to have security at a method level instead of just having it at this level here. Okay, so that's all we have to do. So at this point, our security configuration is pretty much complete. There's not much else we have to do here. Again, there's more configuration that you can add here. You can be very specific on the URLs. You can add, say, hey, if someone is accessing a specific URL, they need to have a certain authority or a permission or something like that. But we don't need to do that here. And I'm going to show you how you can do that later at the method level. And it's super easy to do here as well. But at this point, we should be good to go. So you see how in the constructor, we have an error here on the entry point and another one on the password encoder. And that's because we forgot to add the component on the authentication entry point. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do component, and that should fix the error. can see it went away. And then we have to actually create a bean for the bcrypt encoder. And you can actually do this in this class, like I just created a bean for this. But I like to do it in the main class of the application, so that this can be created whenever the application is launching the first time, so that it can create the bean at startup. So let's go into the main class here, and then here I'm just gonna do bean, and this is gonna be public. It's gonna be the password encoder, and it's not gonna take anything because we're just returning a bean. And then here I'm just gonna say return a new bcrypt encoder. Okay, so once we do that and we go back, you can see that this goes away now. Okay, so we should be ready to go and test the application for security. So in the next lecture, I'm gonna go ahead and show you how this comes into play whenever someone is not authenticated and then they try to access the application.